All set. Good evening. The call to order the Committee of the Whole for Wednesday, May 26, 2021 at 7:07 p.m. The first item on the agenda is Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand. I pledge allegiance to the
flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Next item, roll call.
Allen? Radafrada? Gerhardt?
Here.
Herbst? Here. Maldonado? Here. Richardson?
Here.
Strassman?
Here.
Udell?
Here.
Wheeler?
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you. Do I have a motion to approve the April 28, 2021 minutes, draft minutes?
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion then? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by aye.
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 Those opposed? The motion carries. On to public appearances for non-agenda items. Do we have anybody on Zoom? We do not. On to the next item. Agenda items, just due to some technical difficulties, I would like to swap 6A with 6B, which is capital improvement plan processes and procedure, and then smart code zoning presentation. Do I have a motion?
Second.
All right. Is there any discussion? All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The motion carries. So we will start with the Smart Code zoning presentation by Lisa McNabble. I'm sure I did not pronounce that correctly. My apologies.
It's okay. It's Lisa McNabola.
McNabola. Thank you.
All right.
I'll turn it over to you, Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. All right. So, Randy very kindly asked me to attend the meeting tonight just to give a kind of introduction to smart code zoning. So primarily, it's because I think sometimes as Plan Commission and Council, you just don't interact as much with the smart code zoning district as you do maybe with projects that are occurring in other zoning districts. So it's just gonna be just a brief overview, kind of going into smart code principles, then the approval process for smart code zoning projects, and then we'll look at a couple of smart code projects that have occurred in the city as well. And I'm just gonna hook up this charger really quick so my laptop doesn't die. It's just thanks. Okay, get started. So quickly, just a little bit of background on why the city has smart code zoning. So smart code zoning was first adopted in 2010, and when it was adopted, it was found to be consistent with a lot of the policies outlined in the comprehensive plan. So things like promoting transit-oriented development, creating mixed-use neighborhoods, and then setting higher architectural standards for private development projects. And then another thing that was kind of going on in the background was the state's smart growth law, which is the same law that requires communities to adopt a comprehensive plan, had also directed cities to adopt a traditional neighborhood development ordinance. And I'll get into a little bit more detail about what a traditional neighborhood development is, but adopting smart code was a way of meeting that directive from the state. So it's just a little bit of background. And then where we are today is we have sort of 3 smart code neighborhoods in the city. So the larger one in the middle is the Nine Springs Uptown neighborhood. To the east, off of MM, it's Terra Vesta. And then the smaller one in like the southwest corner, that's North Park. So that's where, we've come since 2010 to having these 3 neighborhoods that have adopted smart code zoning. So quick overview again of the different things I'm going to cover is smart code principles, the smart code approval process, and then just a brief example of some smart code projects in the city. So the biggest thing is that smart code attempts to promote traditional neighborhood development. And there's, quite a few things that go into traditional neighborhood development, but the main things is that it really promotes human scale over auto-oriented scale, promotes walkability, creates mixed-use neighborhoods, and emphasizes public spaces like sidewalks, parks, and places for social gathering. And so when you're thinking about human scale over auto-oriented scale, it's really thinking about like how does the pedestrian feel on the street? Like, do they feel safe and comfortable? Do they have access to the services that they need? And then, walkability and mixed use play a factor. And then the emphasis on the public space is really thinking about, providing opportunities for public interaction and making that a safe space for people. And then we try to think about, so how does the smart code actually promote traditional neighborhood development? So we've got a few kind of critical elements of smart code that try to do that. So we have block perimeter limits, lot width maximums, and then frontage build-out. So block perimeter limits really gets to this idea of like walkability. So how long is the block? How long does it take from somebody to get to one point, from one end to the block to the next? And then what kinds of services are available to them, like within that block? And then with lot width maximums, you're getting to that human scale element. So if you're limiting the width of a lot, you're then limiting the scale of the building through that. So, rather than having, like in a 300-foot long block, having just one lot with one building and like one building facade, if you're limiting the lot width, you could then have 5 lots on that block with 5 different buildings with different character and different architecture and different uses. So that's one way of creating that mixed-use, human-scale, walkable kind of environment. And then frontage build-out is one that's a little bit new to people who aren't familiar with smart code. So it's really just saying that there needs to be a building facade for a certain amount of the lot width. So like if you have a 100-foot wide lot and the frontage build-out requirement is 80%, that means that there's gonna be a building facade that's 80 feet wide, and it's gonna be set close to the sidewalk. And that the point of that is really, again, thinking about the pedestrian on the sidewalk. An important element of, getting people out to an area and having them spend time there is about creating spatial containment. And one of the ways you do that is by creating a street wall. So frontage build-out creates a consistent facade along a street, and it's really about maintaining that street wall. And so frontage build-out is one of the ways that do that. So this is just, a highlight of some of the elements of smart code and specifically how it relates to the traditional neighborhood design. So another principle is the concept of form-based code. So it's really about focusing on the form and scale of a building rather than the land use. So if you think about some of our other zoning districts in the city, like we have low-density residential, we have business highway, industrial, commercial, and it really focuses on separating uses. And there's really not a lot in the code about the form and scale of the building. And then, so the concept with a form-based code, primarily with the idea that you can have mixed-use neighborhoods, is that different parts of the city can have buildings with a similar form and scale, and that's what creates a space. It's not necessarily about separating uses. It's more about the feel of a place. And then it's also an integrated code, which looks at the relationship between the building, the lot, the block, and the street. So again, focusing more on form and scale and how that creates spaces with different character over the use. So if you think about like a single family neighborhood, you're gonna have a house that's set back far from the street, a narrower sidewalk, less street parking, a narrower road, because that is appropriate for the amount of people that are there and the type of use. Versus in like a downtown area, you're gonna have buildings closer to the sidewalk, wide sidewalks because there's more pedestrians. You're probably going to have like a separate bike path, more parking. So all that contributes to a place, and it's linked to the form and the scale of the uses that are occurring there. So that's one thing. And then the last sort of principle that we wanted to focus on was that it implements the rural to urban transect. So this picture, I think, kind of helps to illustrate this idea. And, this is something that you will find in communities across the world about, just how they develop over time, where as you go from, the outskirts of a community to the center, you're going to see these transects shifting from open space. So transect 1 is going to be like wetlands, floodplains, your kind of natural areas. Then you're moving into a rural zone. So you think of like rural Fitchburg with farmland and separated single-family housing, to transect 3, which is like suburban. So our suburban subdivisions that you see throughout the city with larger single-family lots. And then you're switching like transect 4, transect 5. You're getting more into duplexes, townhomes, mixed-use building, commercial space. Transect 6 would be something like downtown Madison would be sort of the equivalent. And then you always have special districts because there will be, projects that just don't fit into this model. So like large-scale manufacturing or like large employment centers, these types of things. But what Smart Code tries to do is to take this concept of the rural to urban transect and then translate it into a code that's implementable for a community. So how that basically looks within the code is on this picture on the left, you'll see what Smart Code zoning looks like on our zoning map. So anything that's zoned Smart Code is going to show up as this blue color. But what's really happening, on the ground is this picture on the right, where every lot that's zoned Smart Code is assigned a transect. So it's that idea that, different transects have a different kind of character and physical characteristics, and you can translate that into a code to recreate that transect. So if we're looking here on the right, this is Terravesa. And you can see on the outskirts you have, natural areas. So that's like the wetland in the green color. And then you can see transect 3 labeled, sort of on like the outer edges of the community. Transect 4, you're going to start seeing more duplexes, townhomes, and then you have this darker purple, which is the geographic center of the neighborhood. And that's where you're going to see something more like transect 5, which will have maybe multifamily or like more mixed-use commercial spaces. So you're seeing that kind of gradient, as you move through a community about how the community changes over space. And then another way to think of transects, so they dictate the permitted uses and dimensional standards. So in some ways, a transect is more like equivalent to the other zoning districts that we have in the community, where it's saying, what are the permitted uses? So on this image on the left, you can see in transect 3, which is more of like a suburban style transect, we allow duplexes and single family houses. If you look at transect 5, permitted uses include, multifamily, townhouses, duplex, and even some types of single-family housing. So this is how, if you know what the transect is, then you know what types of uses you can expect to see there. And then it also dictates the dimensional standards. So this is something you typically find in other zoning districts as well. So things like maximum building height, lot width, lot coverage, setbacks, and then that frontage build-out. So like each transect is going to have a different frontage build-out. As you move from T3 to T5, the setbacks are going to get smaller. Frontage build-out is going to get bigger because that's inherent to kind of the characteristic of that transect. So going over some of those Smart Code principles. I don't know if you guys had any questions about how that works.
Julia.
So the question is, when you are develop a new Smart Code neighborhood, how do you allocate the transect in the neighborhood? Do you try to, how do you determine that in this area we're going to put like T4, in this one T5? Do you follow like there is a guidelines to do that, or is up to the developer?
Sure. Yeah, so I'll cover that a little bit in this next section, going through the smart code approvals and the Article 3 plans, which is where they allocate transects. I think, so that will govern like how much of each transect there is. I think location is gonna be more, like the actual location of the transect within a neighborhood or community will be more tied to like the bigger picture, like is it closer to Highway 14 or is it not? Or like, you know, where is there existing single family or multifamily or commercial? So thinking about it more in relation to the city. But that it does give the developer some flexibility to decide like this is an appropriate place for Transect 5 versus Transect 3. But I'll definitely cover that a little bit more.
Okay. My question was very similar to Julia's as well, and so if you're going to cover it further in.
Yeah, and then happy to answer more questions.
You just mentioned the developer, though, so the developer does have a say in the designation of the T code. Okay.
Yep.
The city as well? I mean, I
Yeah.
assume there's some type of dialogue and conversation.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, definitely.
Get into
Yeah.
it. Are there any additional questions at this point?
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so we'll go a little bit into the smart code approval process and hopefully answer those questions in more detail, but feel free to follow up as well. Okay, so just kind of brief overview of what the smart code approval process looks like. So Common Council approves ordinance language as well as, you know, any amendments to the ordinance over time, land division, so plat, certified survey maps, and then also rezone requests. So when land is zoned, you know, into smart code, that's something that goes to council. It's a little bit different with smart code is that city staff review and approve the neighborhood scale plans. So similar to neighborhood plans that we use throughout the city, smart code has a similar type of plan. And then also individual projects. So, and with this, the idea is really, and I think the later slides will illustrate this, is that smart code sets very strict standards for development, and every development is held to that standard. And so the sort of fixed rules create a really predictable development versus, you know, some of our other zoning districts. So if you compare that to like planned development districts, which come to council for approval, where it's really the developer is setting their own standards for development, and there's no real guidelines. So that's why there's a lot of oversight. So they have 3 meetings in order to get that kind of rezone. And then they also have architectural design review where Plan Commission is reviewing the project and making sure that they're complying with all those standards of PDD zoning. And that's because, you know, it's really up to the developer to propose that. In comparison, smart code has really set rules and parameters. So, you know, when smart code was approved back in 2010, it was found that staff approvals would be appropriate. And we'll get into, I think, some of those standards a little bit more in the following slides. So, like I mentioned, every smart code neighborhood has a neighborhood plan, which we refer to as an Article 3 plan. So this is what allocates transects, establishes the road network, determines block size, designates open space, amongst like many other things. So here you see in this image to the right, this is North Park. So this would be their exhibit showing their transects. So you can see where their transect 5 is, transect 4, transect 3. You can see the road network, which smart code encourages more like of a grid network, discourages cul-de-sacs, things like that. It's determining block size, so we make sure that they're meeting those requirements. And then they're also designating open space. So they have like their main park space, the natural, more kind of open space. And when we get an Article 3 plan, or when they want to amend an Article 3 plan, what we primarily look to is this table, which I know is a lot of information, but I'll kind of walk you through it. So this is just a table that summarizes the requirements in the code in a little bit easier to digest manner. So if we're looking at transect 5 here at the end of the table, so, and then you see here on the edge, or on the other end, the community type. So Fitchburg has traditional neighborhood developments, and we have transit-oriented developments. So Terra Vesta is a traditional neighborhood development, so the densities are gonna be a little bit lower. There's gonna be less transect 5, things like that. And then transit-oriented development is like 9 Springs, and because of its location to the transit center identified in the comprehensive plan, its location of the Highway 14 interchange. It was deemed appropriate for like higher density, more multifamily, more commercial uses there. So once you know the community type, you can start to understand what the development will look like. So in a traditional neighborhood development, you can have 5 to 40% of the neighborhood be Transect 5, versus in transit-oriented development, you can have 40 to 60 of the community be Transect 5. So there you're seeing that with transit-oriented development, it's encouraging a denser style of development versus traditional neighborhood development, which requires higher percentages of Transect 3, so like more traditional single family, and Transect 4, which is gonna be like duplexes and townhomes. So this is, any Article 3 plan, when they're allocating the transects, for example, they have to be within these predetermined ratios, I suppose. So that's where, once the code is adopted, you know that the Article 3 plans are gonna be within these parameters that were established in the code. It also shows you what the densities are. So in Transect 5, it's a 12 dwelling units per acre minimum. Transect 4, it's 6 to 12 or 6 to 14, depending on the neighborhood type. It also, it requires a certain amount of residential. So Transect 5, the whole point is that it's supposed to be like mixed use, commercial, different types of housing being provided. But they obviously want to see a certain amount of residential uses to ensure that it truly is a residential community. So they're, they have to have, I think it's at least 40% residential, 80% max. So that's how you kind of ensure a balance of uses. So Transect 5 has to have at least 20% commercial space by acreage. So that's how you know that you can expect a certain type of development. And we have the block perimeter maximums, which decrease as you become more dense. And even it dictates the type of street. So here you see thoroughfares. So we have boulevard, avenue, street, road, rear lane, rear alley. And these are only appropriate in certain transects. So for example, like in Transect 5, a boulevard is permitted, but it's not gonna be permitted in Transect 3. Because a boulevard's gonna have an 8-foot wide sidewalk. It's gonna have street trees regularly spaced. It's gonna have street parking on both sides, 2 lanes of traffic, right? That's not something you would expect to see in a single family residential area. So you even can, start to get an idea of what the neighborhood's gonna look like based on the type of street network. And they have to meet these development standards for the neighborhood. And it even, gets into civic space, so park space. There's different types of park spaces that are appropriate in different transects. So in Transect 5, you would expect to see maybe like a plaza or a square, something you see in a kind of urban area, providing public space for the people that live and work there. But that's not something that you would expect to see in Transect 3. You would expect to see something more like a neighborhood park or a conservancy area. So again, different ways where the SMART code provides predictable standards for development, so ideally people know what to expect based on the language of the code. So that's Article 3 plans. Article 5 plans, so every SMART code lot has one Article 5 plan. An Article 5 plan, I think, is more equivalent to like architectural design review, which does not go to council, but they go to Plan Commission. It requires a little bit more information because that's just inherent to SMART code. But an Article 5 plan is going to identify the building use, the density, the site plan, and the architectural design. And again, similar to the neighborhood plan, there's going to be, fixed rules for the expectations for private developments. So with an Article 5 plan, things that are like different, projects are typically go to architectural design review because we really don't have set standards for development in our zoning code. But SMART code is different in that it sets specifications for building materials, the amount of windows on a building, the type of front entrance, so like what the front door looks like, and that's even from single family all the way to a commercial building. They have to have a certain type of entrance. It requires parking to be located at the back of the lot, and there's landscaping minimums, which is something we also don't have in our other zoning districts. So this is just another example of the type of information that's expected from a developer and is all outlined in the code. So, building materials, multifamily and commercial buildings aren't allowed to use vinyl. And if they want to use vinyl, then they have to get approval from Plan Commission. So again, talking about setting higher standards for private development projects, Smart Code was a way of accomplishing that goal. So that's kind of covering the Smart Code approval process. Do you guys have questions about that?
Yes, Julia.
So you mentioned at the beginning that we have only 3 neighborhoods right now, that follow a Smart Code. How do we bring another one to the city? Who initiate that? Is the city, a developer bring an idea? How
Yeah.
do you create
So-
another a Smart Code neighborhood?
Sure. Yeah, so I was not here, I think, when a lot of these neighborhoods were rezoned to Smart Code, but another reason that I didn't mention earlier is that, when Smart Code was getting adopted, there was a lot of pressure for greenfield development on the eastern part of the city, and I know, the city planner at the time was definitely trying to think of, how can we have efficient and smart development if we're gonna be bringing in, hundreds of acres into the city. And so Smart Code was seen as a way of accomplishing that and not, developing the same way we always have with sprawl and, these kinds of things. So I think it was probably a combined effort between the developer and the city, but I wasn't here. I mean, I don't know if, yeah.
Here. Sonia Kriesel, City Planner, for those of you I haven't met yet. In addition to what Lisa described, I think some other ways that a new Smart Code neighborhood could be established would be kind of that back and forth negotiated conversation when a new larger scale development in concept is brought to the city. So city staff working with economic development and alders and the mayor in those initial conversations and sort of determining which policy approach might be best. But that's guided by an even bigger picture, including something like at the neighborhood planning stage. So for example, was it the North Stoner Prairie neighborhood, so at Lacey and Seminole, that area, when that neighborhood plan, which encompasses approximately 270 acres, was being developed, there are different land use alternatives within that plan, and that were fleshed out during the planning process. So they came up with land use plan option 1, land use plan option 2, for example, and then there's also an alternative which would have shown how you could achieve development of that neighborhood through Smart Code. So sometimes during those planning processes, that conversation might be vetted out at the larger scale. And then when the council or the plan commission is reviewing a neighborhood plan and considering the adoption, they might look at a recommendation like that or a policy or an analysis and decide whether they want to weight that more heavily or really encourage Smart Code in certain areas. And then one final piece of that is the sector plan map, which, are you still going to touch on that further? Okay. So we have our general land use map, which dictates like parcel-specific land uses, and that's the map that you most often see as council members or at the Plan Commission when you're considering whether to rezone a parcel and whether it's consistent with the future land use map. We also have what's called the sector plan map, which is analogous to that, and it's what guides the Smart Code zoning. So that will tell you where, at the city scale, the appropriate locations are for different Smart Code neighborhoods. So it kind of, it puts them on the same level. The future land use map and the sector map, they're the same sort of policy weight, but it just allows you that option of traditional Euclidean zoning or, if appropriate, Smart Code. So it's that option of going in that direction.
Very good. Julia, you have a follow-up? Go ahead.
So where do we can find those sector map? In the website, they're there, or like the other ones?
Yep, on the city planning website under City Map Gallery.
I have one additional question, and it kind of goes back to the earlier comments. Fitchburg is unique in that it is the only city in the state with smart code? Or is there other cities within the state or within the country itself?
I know there are definitely other communities in the country.
Okay.
I'm still not aware of any in Wisconsin.
Right, I think smart code itself is a model ordinance adopted under the Congress for New Urbanism. So it's a specific type of form-based codes, form-based code. There are other communities that have form-based codes, but they're not smart code and they're not implemented maybe at the same scale. So the city of Sun Prairie, for example, I know they have downtown guidelines on their main street that discuss form as the main driver of that policy, and they try to de-emphasize the use, not unlike our smart code. But it's not the same in the scale and the scope and the specificity of it. I believe we still are the only one in Wisconsin with smart code.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other questions? Okay, move forward.
All right, so the funner part, we can see a little bit about what smart code actually translates to on the ground. So we have, this is an example of a transect for development. So this is No Oaks Ridge, which is a part of the sort of Nine Springs Uptown neighborhood. So this picture on the left, you can see a townhouse-style development in smart code. So you can see that it's close to the street. They have porches that are projecting out into the front yard. There's stairs that lead, directly to the sidewalk. Green terrace area, street parking, and it has a similar style development across the road. So that's kind of what you can expect to see. And then you can see down the street, there's a single-family style development on the same street as townhouses. So this picture on the right are some of the single-family homes on No Oak. So what that looks like is, again, porches that project out into the front yard, connection straight to the sidewalk. You can see that there's not a lot of variation in the home. Still trying to create that street wall even in single-family areas. Garages are required to be set back 20 feet from the front of the home. Driveways can only be 10 feet at the sidewalk, so human scale over auto-oriented scale, creating that kind of safe pedestrian environment. You can see the smaller setbacks between the houses. So that's sort of, what T4 tries to encourage for single-family development. And then an example of what does the multifamily project look like in smart code. So this is Prima, which is at the corner of East Sherrill and Lacey Road, also in the Nine Springs neighborhood. And if we're looking at this picture on the left, you can see again, it's set back 12 feet from the sidewalk. You have a sidewalk with grass area, street trees, and then this is actually a dedicated bike path here, and then you have the street parking. Smart code multifamily buildings are also required to provide street connections to their parking areas, so someone can go, safely from the parking lot to the sidewalk. They're required to provide these street screens to sort of block the parking areas, and again, helping to maintain that street wall. So street screens are a way of doing that. And then you can see again, there's not a lot of variation in the building facade. Porches project outward. Part of the idea is that, you're trying to encourage that kind of social interaction. So rather than having porches be set back really far in the building and people are sort of enclosed in their own space, they're going to be outside. They can see each other. They can see people on the sidewalk, things like that. And if you look at just a different angle of this building, you can also see every unit has a sidewalk connection directly to the sidewalk here. And then this area, you can't tell in this picture, but this corner is designated as a retail ready space. So, right now in Nine Springs, they're still kind of trying to create the demand for commercial and the mixed use space. So retail ready is a way of having space that's suitable for commercial development if the demand is there. And it could be converted to provide a commercial use in that neighborhood, but in the meantime, it can provide a residential amenity or something like that. So an example of flexibility that smart code provides developers that otherwise would not be available to them. And then special districts, so this is an example. So this is Phoenix headquarters, also on Lacey Road, so just across the street from some of the apartments. So the city created a special district for Phoenix because of the type of manufacturing that they were doing was not going to allow them to comply with, the standards of development, let's say in Transect 5. So they have federal regulations which dictate where their buildings can be located. So in order to provide them the flexibility to meet federal regulations, but also meet the intent of Smart Code, you create a special district. So some of the ways where, some of the standards were reduced, let's say for a special district, is in a transit-oriented development, you typically wouldn't allow like a one-story element of a building. They don't have a main entrance on the street. Instead, it's set back here in their parking lot area. In their manufacturing space, they're not going to provide first floor windows, even though that's required per the code. They also were allowed extra space for phasing so that they could expand in the future, but technically still meet the code. So that's an example of a special district development that you could see in the city. And I believe that is it for Smart Code overview. If you have any other questions, I'm happy to answer them.
I don't believe so. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dave.
So when we look at the Smart Code, the density, stormwater impervious area per acre is our I should know this. I'm taking that into account in our stormwater. More stormwater. Generate more stormwater. When the buildings take up the majority of the acreage on the land, I'm just curious if our stormwater plans are taking that into account. I'll have to check with Bill on that.
Yeah, so, when an Article 3 plan is approved, it goes through the same, gets sent out to all the departments. So Public Works, works with the developer to create stormwater facilities that can accommodate that development. So it's treated as like, if a plat is approved, or with like the McGaw Park neighborhood plan, they estimate the types of uses, the demand, the impact on facilities, and then they plan accordingly. Yeah.
Okay. Additional questions? I don't believe so.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah.
We appreciate your time.
Yeah. I didn't know you were here. I thought you were at home. Oh. Just gotta grab my charger. Yeah, good luck.
Oh, okay. So it is out there. We did receive it.
What code did I need to code, right? I have this one.
I guess I can announce it. It was just brought to my attention that the presentation was sent out to the entire council back on April 23rd. So it is out there in your email. But I would reach out to Sonia or Lisa if you do not have a copy of it. Misty, just let me know when you're ready.
One more minute.
Okay.
1 second. I haven't done an in-person presentation in a long time. This is very unnerving for me right now. Okay. I am ready whenever you are.
Okay, very good. Up next is Misty Dodge, our Director of Finance, and she will be presenting the Capital Improvement Plan processes and procedures. Go ahead, Misty.
Yeah. Thank you, Randy, and all of you for the opportunity to speak to you. Those of you that have been on the council before, a lot of this is going to look the same. I have updated the numbers so that you can see the current information. But I think this is still an important conversation to have because it really just sets the stage and puts us in the right frame to start the CIP and budget process. I know you've all heard me say this before, but I still think budget is the most important decision that you're going to make because it sets the service level that you're going to provide to the community and then sets that property tax and priorities for the community. So I appreciate the time to go through this stage setting. Oh, and before I go too much more, so no, you did not miss it. The mayor's proposed CIP has not been released yet. It gets released next week, June 4th. I will email you all, letting you know it's available on the website when the time comes. Tonight, I'm going to focus more on kind of that background and the context, just so we have that frame of reference before we go into this process. So there's 4 main parts to the presentation tonight. There's the background information on the city's finances and processes. There's 3 different constraints that we have to keep in mind as we're going through this process. There's some relatively new comparative data resources that I think are fun that I wanted to share, and then just the very mechanics of the CIP process and next steps. So first, for an overview of the city's finances and budgeting. So there are 6 different fund types within the city. And one of the biggest differences between governmental accounting and corporate accounting is these funds. So think of them as like little individual business units that the city keeps track of so that we can run reports, we can do an analysis on the individual pieces, as well as combine them all into the citywide piece. So these are the different fund types that we have. The general fund at the top is the one that we talk about the most. This is the main operational fund of the city. It does public service, administration, public works, recreation, conservation, and development. A lot of the stuff that we do is out of the general fund. But as we talk about the CIP, the 3 funds that we're going to focus on is the debt service fund, which is where we make the principal and interest payments on the debt that we borrow. The capital projects fund, which is the piece of our property taxes that go to capital projects or those bigger fixed asset types. And then the enterprise funds, which is the utilities, so the water, sewer, and stormwater utility. Wanted to talk about some terminology, because it's a fairly complex process, and it's helpful for us to at least be using some of the same words, or when I'm using a word in the document or in presentations, it's helpful to have kind of a definition of what those are. So the first one is property tax levy. So this is the amount of property taxes that we charge all of the property owners in our community. And to get to that number, this is where the council, through the budget, will set what the service level is that you want to provide to the city or to the community. We'll have to figure out what that cost is. Then we'll subtract out all of the other revenues, the shared revenue that we get, the fees that we charge, interest revenue, all of that stuff. And whatever the difference is between how much we want to spend on those services, less how much other revenue we get, is how much property taxes we have to charge everybody. And that's the property tax levy. That's the big dollar amount across the city that we need to collect. Then there's the AV, or assessed value tax rate. That is how we allocate that amount that we need to collect across all of the property owners. So that's a rate based on per $1,000 of assessed value. So if you look at our last year's tax bills, the ones that people are paying currently, if they're on installments, you'd look at last year's AV tax rate for just the city is $7.70. The average home last year was $330,100. So you would take that $330,000, divide it by 1,000, because the rate is per 1,000, multiply it by the rate, and the average home last year paid $2,537 in city property taxes. Now, I know a lot of you are thinking, if I have a $300,000 house, my taxes are a lot more than $2,500. That's because the city is only about 1/3 to 35% of the total tax bill. This chart here is from the adopted budget. I like this one because it shows that history of the average home, because a lot of times people are tempted to look at what that rate is, but the rate is also a function of the values. So I think looking at this as the average home is just a better way to look at the trends over the years. So what this is the average home in 2010 paid just shy of $1,900. The average home in 2020 paid that $2,500 that we just calculated. Some big changes, so 10 to 11 was when we created that new library and they became operational. And then from 14 to 17, you can see there's a pretty big spike there too. That was when we built the new fire stations. We had a few large road projects, and then we had some additional public safety personnel that were hired. And then now we're still on an increase amount, but it's not quite as steep as back then. And that's because of the continuation of the the large projects that we're doing.
Is the average home, is that based on, you're saying it's say $330,000 over this term? You're saying it was $330,000 every year, or you're bumping it up every year for the increased assessments, which?
Yep, it's a function of both. So that's this chart at the bottom. So the average home value has gone from $265,000 in 2010 to the $330,000 in 2020. And then you can see our rate too. But since that is a function partially of the values, that's where we like to look at this city tax on the average home to get a better feel for that. So it's the true average home in the community each one of those years.
Do you have a follow-up to that, Dave? Or-
No.
No? Okay, go ahead, Misty.
Excellent. The next slide, this is out of the budget as well. This is the property taxes by function. This is one of my favorite pages to talk about with the public when they want to know where their tax money goes. Because this looks again at that average home, and it says, for your bill, this is exactly where your money goes by function. So this first orange bar is those assessed values for the average home. You can see that's different over the last 3 years. And then the green bar is that average home tax amount that we calculated. So there's that 2537 again. And then I included the change from year to year. So if you look from 2020 budget to 2021 budget, it was a change, an increase of 2.5%, which personally I think is pretty reasonable, especially considering the growth that we're seeing. Also wanted to point out, though, this purple section. So this is the debt service and the capital projects portion of the property tax levy. These percentages here are how much of that bill goes to these functions. So it's not a change number, it's how much of that bill. So for debt service, you can see 2019 budget, it was 15.4, 2020 budget 15.6, and then 14.9. So right around 15%, which is a pretty fair number. It's definitely reasonable. It is going down. That's because we've been prepaying debt, and we issued a lot of debt relatively recently when we had a lot of projects happening at the same time. And we're trying to pay down that debt because we know we've got some other big projects that we're going to need to borrow for soon. So that's been relatively consistent. One of my concerns, however, is if you look at that property tax, or the capital projects portion of it. So the 19 budget, capital projects, the levy paid for capital for 7.1%. The year after was 6.4, and this last year we're at 5.9. So what this is telling me is that we are shifting away from our capital project commitment from property taxes, and we're shifting it towards operating. I have another slide later where we'll talk about that. But that's an important thing to look at, especially when we're talking about the CIP. So we talk about targets, the portion of our levy that should be going towards capital, and we've been eroding that a little bit for other priorities. And that's important because capital stuff, you can only delay it for so long before it becomes a problem. So it's something to make sure we keep in mind.
Gabriella, you have a question?
Yeah, I love this chart too. I think it's so useful, and I've dug into this quite a bit, and I've shared it with people before. One of the things I noticed is when you look across all the different services, it seems like those amounts are pretty consistent. And I'm talking about the service areas, general government, public safety, mass transit, et cetera. But the tax increment district, that seemed to have spiked recently. And I don't know if it's kind of hard to see on this, but it was 233 in 2019, 255 in 2020, and it's 339 in 2021. So I guess it occurs to me that reduction in capital projects, if it's going into if that money is shifting to TID, it seems like it's still ending up in capital improvements because most TID money goes to capital improvements, or am I misinterpreting that?
That's fair. So the reason why that spike is okay is because our TIDs are successful, so that is good. And yes, TID money indirectly goes towards capital sometimes, but more of our TID money up until recently has been towards developer incentives. So capital from a building perspective, not necessarily from a city infrastructure perspective. So.
You have another question, Mayor Richardson?
Are you going to talk tonight about the Moody's presentation and the things that they kind of ding us on? Okay.
Yep.
Perfect.
Dave, you have a question?
Would I be stating it correctly if I said that we are, when I look at this chart, we are borrowing more money for our operational expenses?
No.
No?
We are definitely not borrowing for operational
Good,
expenses.
all right.
That's very important to be clear about. Definitely not. But an amount of our total property taxes that we levy are going towards paying for debt.
I think any additional questions? Nope. Okay, Misty.
A little bit more terminology, so general obligation notes and bonds, or GO notes and bonds. This is the debt that we issue when we go out to the external market and say we want to borrow money to pay for those large legacy projects. There's two important reasons why this is the cheapest kind of money that we can borrow. One is that it's tax exempt. So the interest that we pay to the people that lend us money is exempt from a federal perspective, not a state perspective. I know you're going to ask, but just federal. For CETA it would be, yeah, but not for our GO stuff. But since they don't have to pay taxes on the interest we pay them, they're willing to take a lower interest rate because the net amount is the same for them. And then it's also very secure. So that general obligation means that we are putting our full faith and backing of the municipality that we will levy enough property taxes to make those debt payments. So the people that are lending us money know that they're going to get paid back. So it's very secure, it's tax exempt, so we've been able to get relatively cheap rates for that money. Lately, it's been right around 2% in that ballpark, depending on the term and the life.
Question? Go ahead, Dave.
Just a comment, having sat through these many years, we have been borrowing for many years at historically low rates.
Mm-hmm.
So, far lower than when I first moved to the city. I expect that is going to be changing, in the not too distant future. And I think we need to be cognizant of that, borrowing the same amount of money is going to require more to pay it back. I do not expect the rates, if you're at 2%, it wouldn't surprise me if, 2 years from now we're at 4%.
Any other questions? Oh, go ahead, Misty.
Another important terminology item is fund balance. So this is the difference between the assets that we have, so our cash, the amount people owe us, that stuff, as compared to the amount of money that we owe. So this is very similar to the equity concept, especially if you think of home equity. It's the same idea there. However, another difference between governmental accounting and corporate accounting is that we don't account for fixed assets or long-term debt in our fund balance amount. And that's because when you set your property tax levy, you're really just looking at how much does that amount need to be for the next year for me to meet my obligations for that year. It doesn't necessarily look long-term. We still need to look long-term to make sure that we're financially responsible. But from an accounting perspective, with fund balance, it doesn't factor those in. That number is available, though, in the audit report in the front statements. It's called net position instead. So it's basically very similar to fund balance, but it does include those longer-term items as well. So that's all the terminology that I have. So I'm going to go into some of the other charts that were updated for 2020. So this one here is the expenditure budget by fund. So this is not just the money that we collect in property taxes, how we spend it. This is all of the money that the city gets, how all of it is being spent. So this is from the 2020 annual report for the finance department. The dark blue at the bottom is the general fund. That's that primary operations fund of the city. And it's been relatively stable. The red that you can see is the library fund. That has also been pretty stable. Those two, the blue and the red, are the ones that we talk about during the budget process more so. Here, though, we're really to kick off that CIP process. So that is more in the green, the purple, and that top blue. So green is the debt service fund. You can see it's been getting a little bit bigger recently. We did have an anomaly in 2019, but that was actually a good thing. We paid off a nice chunk of TID 4 debt because they had the cash to do it, and we could stop paying interest on it. So that's why that's a little bit higher in 19, as well as why the light blue bar for the TIDs is a little bit higher in 2019. So that's a bit of a blip, but is actually a great thing, not anything to be nervous about. Then the purple part is the capital projects fund. That has been going kind of sporadically throughout time. Because again, this is all of the money that we spend. So you think of Fish Hatchery Road, a part of it is paid for by debt. We bought a plow truck to do it, which was paid for by property taxes. And then we got money from the county and from the city and from the TID is paying part of it. So the whole amount of the project might change as things go on, but the property tax piece of it was that other chart that we were looking at. And then the light blue at the very top is all of the other funds that we have, TID being the biggest one. Utilities is also included in there. Big things in there are the different TID projects that we've done. So the interchange was a huge one. Again, that's that debt that we paid off in 19. We'll pay off the rest of it in 2020. We're going to prepay it. And then the Fish Hatchery Road, the TID portion is included in there. This chart here is looking at the total tax levy, so the total amount of property taxes that we need to collect for our purposes and for the TIDs over the years. Since that's what we rely so heavily on to fund our budget, that's where a lot of the focus is on during this process. The years also might seem off, so this is based on tax roll year. So the 2021 budget, the one that we're working under now, was paid for with the 2020 tax bills and the 2020 tax rolls. So the years are off a little bit for that reason. You'll see we've increased over the past 10 years. We're at 17.7 million in 2010 and 28.8 million in 2020. But I think there's two things that are making this a little skewed. One is the TID, because that is kind of its own thing, and then the library as well, because that was approved by referendum and was a fairly unique item. So I did this same chart just without those two factors. So you could see that it still was going up, but it wasn't quite to that same magnitude as what it was when you included those other things. So over the past 10 years, looking from 2010 to 2020 for tax levy, it was an average, or it was a total increase of 52% over that 10 years, which is 5.2% per year on average. The blue bottom part is the general fund, so that increased 42% over the past 10 years, or 4.2% per year. The red is the debt service fund, and remember I excluded the debt for the library because that was approved by referendum and was separate. That increased the most, that doubled since 2010, so it's an average of 10% per year. And then the top part is the green. That's really where we're going to focus on the CIP. That's the capital projects amount. That's increased 84% in the last 10 years for an average of 8.4% per year.
I have a question, Ms. As far as the tax levy itself, you know, you hear certain limits and so forth. Are there certain limits that are imposed on us as far as the tax levy itself from a state level?
Yes, and I have
You will
slides in the
speak to that?
future to talk about levy limits. Yep, that's a huge problem.
Okay,
It's a
so-
huge constraint for us.
Okay, you will speak to that, though. Okay, thank you.
Randy?
Dave, a question.
Just an observation, you know, you look at this, and I've run the numbers, and our average citizen would say, all right, I realize things cost more, somewhere in line with the rate of inflation. You know, they understand that. We're running at about twice that, and that is how city spending or whatever gets out of hand when you're going up faster than the rate of inflation, and then things start separating, and that's what that's what I see is happening here, and I don't see any way to rein it in or slow it down. You know, like I say, the average resident can accept rate of inflation or something, but when we're going up at twice as much, our spending, that's not going to end well.
Comment about that?
Julia.
You need to consider, Dave, that the city has grown a lot too. So you have to put that in the equation too. So as the city grows, we have more, expenses, expenditure. We have new neighborhood. We have more things to maintain. So that one is another thing that you need to put in the equation. You can, this is how I see it. We are a city in motion, growing, and we grow 5,000 people every 10 years. So plus all the new development that are coming, and so you know.
I would counter that. I agree. I can't dispute that. You know, it's going to cost more for a bigger city, but someone like me that's lived here 33 years, I'm paying for that. I'm paying for that growth. The tax bills the city spending's going up. Additional development and things would be paying more taxes. But we are, the rate, we're paying more. The average citizen is paying more than the rate of inflation above the growth.
Can I make a comment?
Sure, one more, and then we'll turn it back over to Misty.
Well, but I want to clarify
Go ahead.
thing because,
Yes, I understand.
So we need to consider that I agree with you that we need, the inflation has been like 2-3%, but then we need to understand also that the construction cost have been, the rate of increase have been like you have 30% in lumber, you know what I mean, or something like that. So you need to put a lot of things in the equation before you can make a comment like that, okay? So yes, inflation is one factor, but then we have other factors that have happened in the last 5 or 6 years. When the city is growing, we are building more, and now the construction costs are going up like 2 or 3 or more times than the pace of the inflation. So,
Gabriella, if you have a question.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick comment too for those that are watching. This is a big conversation, and I know taxes are always a hot topic because it's a lot of money. I get that tax bill, and I encourage people to go back to that chart that Misty showed a little while back where it shows you like average home price, how much of your money goes into each bucket. Mm-hmm. I think that's such an important, because I think sometimes people hear that their taxes are going up and they have a preconceived notion of the thing that's going up is maybe the thing that they don't want to pay for, which is fair, But I think going back to those numbers and like seeing where the increases are, because obviously it's not a perfect corollary because people's houses aren't, but I think you can see that what is going up, what's going down, and that's why like when I look at that chart, that like increase in the TID was like surprising to me, and it's something that I've been like trying to like wrap my mind around a little bit more and trying to learn a little bit more, and so I don't think we have to have that conversation right now, but I am interested in like what that means and what the function of that is. So anyway, I think this is a big conversation. Anyone that's really interested in learning about their taxes and why they're going up, this chart is like gold.
Okay, thank you. Turn it back over to you, Misty.
The only other thing I'd like to add is, to your point, Dave, in particular, is that's why we focus really on that city tax for the average home. That other chart was the total amount that we're collecting from everybody. So that percentage is inflation, but it's also the new people that are contributing towards. So I think this chart instead is a better place to look. And I didn't calculate what that percentage is. I should do that, and I'll make a note for next year to do that. So back to where we were. Let me click. There. So, process. Let's go there now. So annual budget is not the stage that we're at now, but that's really where we will be going soon. That is a conversation that has a lot of attention, as it should, because again, that's where you're setting what level of service you want to provide, and that balance between tax collection and services and spending. That's where you guys have a lot of important decisions that you need to make. So during the budget process, you decide that level of service, we figure out what that cost is going to be, then you also decide how that's going to get paid for, whether it's through state aid or fees or property taxes. And then the difference is how much of that property tax levy that we need to collect from everybody, and then that's what goes on the property tax bills. So while we're not at this stage yet, and you'll see me again right before we kick off the budget process to go into a little bit more on that piece of it, but this is an incredibly important document. But before we get there, though, we do the CIP, which is the process we are just about to kick off now. So the majority of our budget does go towards personnel. I think it's like 80% of our budget goes to personnel. And that makes sense, because at our heart, we are a service provider. We're not making widgets, we are providing a service to our community. So that makes sense that the bulk of our budget goes there. But if you look at the big dollars, that's really where the CIP becomes important. We can drop $6 million on a road, and we need to know and plan for that. We can't just have it appear. So that's why the CIP is so important. Really, It is a planning document, so you're not obligating any funds necessarily through this process, but it's our way to plan, identify the challenges and opportunities we're going to have from a financial perspective in the next 10 years, and then make sure we make those decisions. So in order for something to be capital, it has to have a 5-year life, and then it has to be either $10,000 individually or $50,000 for the group of items, but bought infrequently. So for example, this table is less than $10,000 on its own, so that wouldn't become a CIP project. But if we were replacing all of the tables and all of the things in this room, that's more than $50,000 as a whole. It's very infrequent. That's something that we would want to put into the CIP. So this document is a 10-year look. I'll ask you to keep in mind that the first 5 years are the more vetted projects. So a lot of municipalities have just a 5-year CIP, where you literally look at the ones that you know, there might be tweaks here and there, but for the most part, this is what the plan is from a capital perspective. This is what we want to do. The back 5 years are those unvetted projects, like get them on the radar so people know about them, kind of think about them, get talking about them, but we don't really put a bunch of staff time or effort or any of that into those projects at that point because they are very fluid. We don't know for sure that they're going to happen. We definitely aren't going to commit to them, but we want them on the radar so people are aware that they exist. Part of the reason why we did that is just so we could plan better, so we have a fuller picture. But we also ran into a problem where things would be in year 5 and then it'd go to year 6 instead as a strategy and it would fall off the plan. And so it's a lot harder to say that I know for sure that that truck's not going to be replaced in 10 years than it is to say in the next 5 years. So it's a way for us to plan better. We also assume different growth percentages. Ellers will be here at the next committee of the whole to talk about our financial management plan based off of the mayor's proposed CIP, which will look at all of the financial policies that I'll talk about later and what our financial future would look like based on that. We do have a lot of assumptions in there, growth percentages and inflation assumptions and all of that stuff, but it is an important planning document to make sure we're prepared. And then what happens is that first year of the CIP, so right now we're going to be working on the 2022 to 2031 CIP. Once you guys adopt it, that 2022 column will go into the first version of the budget that I present to the mayor. And then if he makes any changes, he has to disclose those to you. So it doesn't set firmly, but it sets at least that first draft of the budget when we go to that point. So budget constraints. So Randy, this is what you were asking about. So there's actually 3 different constraints that I want to talk about. One is the optional expenditure restraint program, or ERP. The other one is state-imposed levy limits, and then the adopted financial policies that the city has committed to. Now, I'm not going to talk about taxpayer appetite or willingness to pay taxes at all, much less increase taxes. That is very subjective and probably changes household by household. And frankly, I have a sense that you know what your constituents feel in that area. So I'm going to really focus on those more objective calculations of the constraints that we have. So expenditure restraint, first, is an optional program. So we are not required to participate in this program, but there's a really good reason to. So we get $600,000 that we don't have to levy people for because we participate in this program. So while it is optional, it's definitely a hurt if we don't qualify. So the original intention of this program, which is a state program, is to encourage municipalities just to limit their growth in spending. To qualify for the program, first your mill rate or your equalized value, not your assessed value tax rate, your EV tax rate, has to be more than $5 per thousand. Ours was $7.75, so we very much so meet that requirement. Really, this program is designed for those bigger municipalities to encourage them to restrain their spending. The bigger part of the calculation, though, is how we know if we qualify to get that funding. And so what that formula is looks at your general fund expenditures, which includes transfers out and property taxes within other funds. So it's a relatively complicated formula. It also is a different formula than levy limits, so things are affecting it in different ways. But the percentage that we increase this amount has to be less than 60% of our net new construction for a maximum of 2% increase allowed, plus the CPI increase through August 31. And they just changed that recently to be August instead. So that restrains us as well. We do have at least one strategy built into our budget to help us kind of weather some at times when we might need expenses to go up, even if it fits within levy limits. But this is another important calculation to keep track of. And that max of 2% is also important. So last year, our net new construction was just shy of 5%. So 60% of that, we should have gotten a lot more growth allowed through the expenditure restraint program, but because of that cap, we did not. So it's just something we have to keep a watch on. So ERP is a factor when we're preparing the CIP because the money goes to pay for capital stuff. And if we don't have it, it's more that we have to levy for capital stuff or delay. But it's not really a focus of the CIP. It's much more a conversation with the budget. The city does have a policy on how we use this money. And this was very strategic and thoughtful. And after council, previous councils conferring with Ellers, our financial advisor. So what we do, rather than applying this money to operations, just general operations, we say that it goes to capital, and we have a delay in when we apply it. The reason for that, both of those pieces, is so that if there is a year when we don't qualify, we have time, and we're not hurting the main operations of the city. You know, it's much easier to delay or not do a capital project than it is to lay off staff because you didn't meet that program. So the timing is, so for example, the 2021 budget, we did qualify. Congratulations, good job. So we're qualified in 2021 budget. We're gonna get that payment in 2022, and we will apply it to reduce the amount of property taxes we have to levy for capital purposes in 2023. So it's that 3-year delay. Again, so if something does go awry and our priorities are on a different line than what the expenditure restraint program is, we at least have some opportunity to react to it without having to be so quick and drastic. The amount of expenditure restraint we get is a lot recently. If you look at the bottom of the chart, we used to start much smaller, and the increase is not because the state applied more money to the program. The pool of funds is the same. The reason why we're getting more is because our taxes is higher and we're a bigger city. So you can see the big jump from 2010 to 2011 when the new library came on and our expenses went up. So we got some money, additional money because of expenditure restraint that year. There was one year with the 2016 budget that we didn't qualify for that program, and that was a decision that was made by that council. In 2019, you can see we got a little blip there. That's because the state changed the rules and there were a lot of municipalities that weren't able to qualify anymore. We were, and so we got the benefit of getting a bigger piece of the pie because there were fewer people or fewer municipalities after the same amount of money. And then for the budgets that we're working on now, we're expecting about $600,000. And so there's that delay again. So the 2020 budget is the amount that's shown in the 2022 CIP. The 2021 budget that we qualified is the amount we'll show in 2023's CIP as a reduction.
Misty, how, for the money, the relief money the city's gonna get, it's gonna affect any of these, ERP or, or tax limit, tax levy limit. They're gonna apply that because I was reading and, I don't know, there is a lot of confusion there.
Do you mean the expenditure restraint, or I'm sorry, the American Rescue Plan funding?
Yeah.
Yes, so it does apply. It's the same as any other money that we would get in. However, there are specific strategies we can use to make it not harm our calculations.
Okay.
So we don't want to use that funding to reduce taxes, for example, because that will erode our base for levy limits in the future. Besides, I don't think it's allowed from the guidelines. And then from an expenditure restraint perspective, I remember that chart where I had all the different funds, the different fund types. We will put that money into what's called a special revenue fund and keep it separate from the general fund. and then spend it out of there. So as long as we are cautious in our accounting, it shouldn't affect our expenditure restraint payment.
Any other questions? Go ahead, Misty.
Levy limits. So this one is the one that's been causing the heartburn lately. So levy limits are state imposed. It is a requirement. You can see the statute language up on the screen. But as opposed to expenditure restraint, which is optional, this is not optional. So it is state statute, plus there are very steep penalties if we don't apply, or if we don't qualify or meet the requirements. So if we don't, there is a dollar for dollar penalty that they will take that out of our shared revenue aid, and it's cumulative. So if there's not enough that first year to make up the amount that we were over levy limits, they will keep taking it from us every year until the penalty is paid in full. And then if you don't drop your taxes to account for that difference, that just continues to build up and become a problem. So levy limits are obviously something very serious and has been a constraint for us, especially recently. Levy limits is primarily based off of net new construction. So this chart here shows for each one of the last budgets what our net new construction has been. As you can see with the 2021 budget, we were just shy of that 5%. And then I included that blue dash line. If you can see it, that's a 3-year moving average line, just to try to give a trend to it. So while we have fantastic net new construction this last year, and then for the budget we're going to work on coming up soon is also very strong, it's not something that we can count on or rely on, because it will set us up for a problem in the future. So just wanted to show you from historical perspective, usually we run 2 to 3% net new construction, and that's the biggest factor in the levy limit calculation. I would also like to point out that net new construction of just shy of 5% is fantastic, but it also means that we are growing, and those new residents and new area will have needs, and that will require more costs to be associated with it too. So we really should be cautious about relying on that net new construction to provide the services that we already are obligated to do.
Dave has a question.
Aaron, you alluded this to me one time, say we had a $200 million increase in, property due to new construction. Okay. So if you looked at the the roughly 7.5% mill rate, you'd say, all right, that should be X number of dollars, but you've alluded that we never get anywhere near that, at least in the first couple of years. Is there a reason for that?
I think you might be talking about a manufacturing building, perhaps.
Possibly.
So something we've seen recently with manufacturing assessed buildings is that there's a different methodology used, for lack of a better phrase, and I'm clearly not the city assessor, so I can't dive into it too much. But we have always seen a difference between the costs that are spent on a manufacturing building and the assessment that turns out to be from the state. And it was usually about 60% to 2/3, I'd say, historically. Lately, we've noticed that's been even more of a differential, and that's part of where we're getting concerns. But for the buildings that are assessed by the city assessor, that's where uniformity is very important. We are also a municipality that revalues every year, so it should be close-ish to the cost that went in.
No other questions? Go ahead, Misty.
Sure. So then when you're looking at levy limits, that 2 to 3% net new construction, which is the historical, other than the last couple of years where things have been going amazingly well, it's been kind of what we could expect. And then you look at the status quo services that we want to continue to provide. And as Dave alluded to earlier, costs go up, inflation happens. So that 2 to 3% net new construction really offsets that 2 to 3% increase in the current services that we are providing. The other thing I'd like to point out is to get to even a 2%, because it sounds like such a small percentage, but it actually takes a lot of new construction to get to that point. So to get to 2% based on this last year, it's $74 million worth of net new, and to get to 3%, it's $111 million in new value. And then as we continue to grow, obviously as a function of math, the bigger we grow, the more new construction you'll need to get to even that 2 to 3% number. So we are in a good spot again this year. So preliminarily, please don't quote me on this number, a board of review has not happened. The state manufacturing numbers we were just talking about aren't coming out until August, so we don't really know what those are going to be at this point either. But based on what we are seeing at this point, we think net new construction for this coming budget is going to be 5.2%. So then you can see, so the first 2 to 3% needs to go to kind of status quo, keeping up with what we're already doing. And then we can spend that other about 2% levy limit increase on either additional needs or expanding services or something there. But as you can see, I've already pointed out, we need to be very cautious about the town of Madison. In my view, I think we should spend as much of that amount as we can on the town of Madison, because we know that there's going to be needs there that need to be addressed. And I guess while we're talking about town of Madison, there's a bit of a timing issue that I just wanted to bring your attention to. So on the revenue side, the city is going to get a levy limit adjustment. It'll be based on the amount of taxes they paid to the town the year before. There's some flaws in that, which I won't necessarily get into, but that's the calculation that we have. The bigger concern for us for 2022 is that that levy limit adjustment won't happen until 2023's budget. Those property owners that become our residents will also pay property taxes, but that won't be until the 2023 budget. The different state aids, the general transportation aid, the shared revenue, all of that, we have a lot of details to work out, but I suspect because the transition doesn't happen until the end of October, that most of those aids also won't be received until 2023. Now, in my head, since I've started, I've always planned to time a TID closure with the town of Madison to help even that blow. However, this is my bad news moment, with the delay in the railroad in TID 4, and then the current assessed value claim in TID 6, the earliest we could close one of those TIDs is again with the 2023 budget, but possibly even the 2024 budget. So basically all the revenue that we're going to get or be able to use to help pay for these costs is happening in 2023 or later. If you look at the expenses though, so the transition happens October 31st of 2022. The bulk of what we expect to have to spend is going to be in staffing. Again, we're a service provider. And I know we've had that committee of the whole meeting where we've talked about those different positions and kind of what the priorities are from the mayor's perspective. So I won't get into that. But there are some positions in there that we can't wait until the day that we take over the town to hire. You know, think of the police officers, for example. They have to go through police academy. They have to be acclimated to the department. You can't, just assume that they'll be available to the residents that same day that they're hired. So those will probably have to be planned for the bulk of the year, if not the full year. Some of them, yes, we can wait until real close to the annexation date, but some of them will have to be for more than that. But either way, it's mostly 2022. On the capital side, I see two different buckets. So there's the equipment that we're going to need to address it. So like we have to buy a snow plow to help do that. There's a 6 to 12 month lead time on those. So we can't, again, wait until we annex them to buy that plow. We're going to have to plow it in winter, a couple of months later. And then the squad cars and things like that. So a lot of that equipment stuff will need to be done in 2022 as well. The other big capital piece is infrastructure. We still don't know exactly what that looks like. We need to spend some time doing an inventory and an analysis of what the quality is of the assets that we're going to get and be required to maintain. But my gut is that there's going to be a lot of, maybe not immediate needs, but pretty high needs that we'll need to address quickly, shortly thereafter the annexation. So some of that we may be able to delay, but not all of it. So as you probably noticed from the year, so the revenue is coming in for the most part in 2023, and the expenses are happening in 2022. So this does play a little bit into the CIP because there is some capital stuff, but even more so it's going to be important as we look at the budget process. And now I do have an idea of how I think we can get through this. I don't want to share it at this point because it's not fully fleshed out, and I'll also say it's a very dangerous strategy, especially if council's not committed to the full multi-year plan of what I'll present to you guys as an option. So I don't want to panic you necessarily. I think there is a way through this, but we're going to have to be cautious. I think we need to tread lightly because I don't want to use this thing to hurt us in the long run. At the same time, this is an exceptionally unique situation. I mean, how many times have we ever annexed a town? So I think we can justify to the taxpayers and to Moody's and to everybody that we can use a unique strategic option to address this highly unusual situation. So just need to be cautious.
Go ahead, Julia, yes.
So can you repeat again why we are delaying the closing of the TID 4 and 6? I didn't register that.
So the magic date with TID closures is April 15th.
Yeah.
So at this point, we missed the closure for the 2022 budget because we didn't close before April 15th of 2021. And that was intentional. I mean, you guys just approved $1.something million for the railroad projects, which I think was important. But that delay there is going to make it so that we can't close TID 4 until after that project is done. So we got the contracts in line before that expenditure period, but we don't want to close it until we know that the project is done and fully paid for.
Okay.
And then on TID 6, there's a large assessed value claim in the process. So it's going to the courts. I believe it's scheduled for December of this year. So hopefully it will all get resolved quickly and we can take care of it and then close by April 15th of 2022. Then we would be able to use that closure for the 23 budget. But if not, I'd hate to have the city take on that risk of that full payment if there's one required, rather than having it get paid through the TID.
Okay, I have another question. Do you remember that we have, we talked in previous meeting about keep the TID open 1 year more to fund the housing fund? So what is going to happen?
We're still planning to do that.
Okay.
So there is an option to use cash reserves to pay
Okay.
for that 1 year.
Oh, okay.
So we're going to technically keep it open in a year, but then we're going to close it right away.
Okay.
And then use cash to pay
we
for that
can-
amount.
okay.
But that has not fallen off the radar for
Oh,
sure.
okay.
Nope. Yeah, no, that's a lot of money that I know, look at his eyes are big. No, that is still, that is still on the plan. Yep.
Any other questions?
So, do we receive any help from the state when we are, in the case that we are taking another town? I know that the only thing that we can do is the adjustment to the tax levy, but don't we have any other, fund from the state? Because we are getting, it's going to have a great impact in our budget, and it's not fair that the rest of the residents had to pay for all the mismanagement of a town, you know what I mean?
So the state's argument to that is going to be that the town has been functioning, and we will be allowed to increase our property tax levy by that levy limit adjustment. Again, flawed adjustment, but at least there's an adjustment. The state aids will get divvied up somehow, we hope. We're trying to get answers still from the Department of Revenue on how that's going to work. So there is some adjustment for that. The money that used to go to the town will go between the two cities, but nothing in addition to that, generally from the state to us.
One of the things we are trying to do, and I'm working with Mike and Misty on this, and the county, or the cities and villages, is that we would lose expenditure restraint for a year by when we get the town of Madison, which is $600,000, which is a lot. We are working to try and get the legislature to give us a waiver for that year so that we still get that money. The problem is we live in Dane County, and the Republicans control the joint finance. So it's been done in the past. If we were in a different county, the odds would be a lot higher. But we are working with them. John Erpenbach is one of the people on that, and he's for it, obviously. But there's also more Republicans and Democrats on that. And so that's going to be the challenge. We hope that they will say, yes, we've done it before, we'll do it for you. This is a unique situation. There's no guarantees.
I have another question.
Another question. Go ahead, Julie.
Okay, so the town of Madison is getting relief money, too.
Correct.
So how we're going to control that they don't use all the money before we get it? We get the town, you know what I mean? Because we are going through an annexation that is happening, is imminent. It happened next year. So there are any legal action that we can take so for them to don't we use that funds and then we can use some part of those funds for the annexation? You know what I mean?
No legal ramifications to tell them they can't spend that money, no. My hope, of course, is that they will be professional and spend it within the guidelines and make sure they know what those strings are. If a municipality doesn't spend it with the guidelines, there's a clawback, and they'll have to pay it back. I don't know how that would work. In theory, they'd have to go after the town, which doesn't exist, and not come back to us, but there's something to give some thought to. My hope is that they'll find a way to spend it within the confines. It'd be great if they saved it for us and let us spend some of it, but I honestly don't see that happening.
I have my last question. But they're going to receive 2 installment payment, isn't it? So I think the second installment is going to be when we get the town, no?
No, so we get our first installment in about a month,
Okay.
and then the second tranche will be a year after that. So it'll be on the tail end of their existence, yes. But they'll still be in existence at that point. You also don't have to wait to get the money to spend it. So in theory, if there was a project that they wanted to put all that money towards, they could spend it now to meet the requirements and then reimburse themselves when that second tranche comes in. They will also, though, have us, I don't remember what their dollar amount is, but my guess is it's probably enough to require a single audit. So hopefully that will help protect us as well.
Gabriella, go ahead.
This is kind of just a general question, but it always sounds like with these Town of Madison conversations that it sounds like there's a lack of transparency. Is that true? Like, are we in like regular communication with the leaders over there, and can we like make the request, like, or like ask them what their plans are with that money so that we know? It always sounds like there's like we want to know, but we're not allowed to know for some reason. That's always how it occurs to me.
Yeah, I guess my perspective is more, I think they will tell us if we want to, and if nothing else, they go through audits just like we do. But it's more of a, we don't have control over how they do things. So I think we can ask them, but we can't obligate them to treat things in a certain way.
Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, Gabrielle, I'd just add, I feel the same way about that. And there was fire department equipment we were supposed to get that the city of Madison took over the fire service, and now it's theirs. And so, well, what else is going on behind the scenes?
I think what actually happened is that they contracted with City of Madison to do their fire services, and then they sold all the fire equipment themselves and spent the money. So it didn't go to City of Madison, they just took it for themselves.
Moving on.
Anyone else? Go ahead, Misty.
Excellent. So levy limits, talking about that net new construction again. So this chart is actually the same as what we did the last CIP, which at that point we were talking about COVID. We're thinking about a year ago now. And so 2 CIPs ago, we had assumed just over 6% net new construction based on what we saw happening. And then every year after, we assumed a 3%, because things were going good and we knew a lot of stuff was moving and everything was great. Last year CIP happened, COVID happened, and we needed to recognize that that was probably going to have an impact on our net new construction. Not right away. There's a lot of projects that clearly are going well. I mean, we think net new construction will still be wonderful for us this year, but we have to recognize that that's not sustainable. So included in last year's CIP, as well as this year's one, at least as of this point, is the red line instead. So it's kind of a more tapered decrease, because we know there's projects that are moving forward, and then a lull there, and then a slow recovery back up to that 2%. Of course, we are all hopeful that this isn't what actually happens, but I'd rather be conservative and reflect COVID and possible impacts and recognize that capital projects, there's always more projects that we want to do than we can. So if something turns out fantastic, we can move a project up that was the next on the priority list but didn't quite make that cut before. So I don't think we're losing an opportunity here, but I think it really reflects our commitment to long-term, realistic planning. So now I'd like to talk a little bit more about that capital project levy comment that I made earlier. So this chart here is what we targeted for the CIP. So our next year's CIP property tax levy amount is always based on that net new construction, or assumed net new construction, because that's the bulk of what the levy limits is based off of. So looking at just 19, 20, and 21's budget, if we would have used net new construction as our target for our capital property tax levy, that yellow line is where our capital levy would have gone. The gray bar then is how much additional property taxes would have been allocated to capital projects. What actually happened is the blue line. So instead of going up with net new construction, we went down with how much we committed to capital purposes, and that got redirected to other pieces. So for the 2020 budget, that went down 4.6% when it should have gone up. And then the year after, it went down a little bit again, 0.5%. So I bring this up because we always struggle to get the CIP to balance, to get it to work based on those assumptions. And part of the problem is because we aren't keeping up with our targets earlier in the years, and that just builds a bigger hurdle for us in the years after. I also included other references to levy limits and other resources in case you're interested. Obviously, won't go into those now. The other constraint that we should monitor and do monitor during the CIP and the budget process is our adopted financial policies. I promise this goes a lot faster than the other slides. Moody's looks at these very closely when we go through our credit analysis. And then when we do our financial management plan with Ellers at our next committee of the whole meeting, we will go through each one of these, or the highlights of these financial policies again, to make sure that that 10-year look always complies with these policies. And if it doesn't, we identify early that we need to make an adjustment to make sure that we comply with them. So first is that Moody's report you were asking about. So this is the first page of that credit rating announcement that they gave us. This would have been done in December of 2020 when we issued our debt last. So this purple part, this is the ratings rationale. We were awarded a AA1 again. We are very proud of our AA1. We worked very hard to get that AA1. But the ratings rationale explains why that is there. And then for those of you that aren't familiar, so AA1 is the second highest from the top. The highest is a AAA. And that's what Mike promised he would get before he retires. So I think, no pressure. But I think this is an important document because Moody's is a very trusted third-party analytical view of our finances. So it tells the bond market when we borrow that we are a good credit, but it also tells our taxpayers that we are financially responsible, we are doing what we need to do, and that, look, Moody's agrees that we are on the top of our game. So that ratings rationale in purple, a couple of highlights that I want to read for you as quotes. So it includes strong financial positions supported by healthy reserve levels, moderate net direct debt and more elevated overall debt and fixed costs, and then constrained revenue raising flexibility due to state-imposed levy limits. So the thing that we control, we're doing great, right? We've got healthy balances, we are conservative budgeting, we are doing well. The things that we can't control as much is the levy limits. I mean, I would love to get rid of those if we could, let you guys make those decisions for the community, but I will get off my soapbox. So some good, some bad. The factors that could lead to an upgrade. So improving our community's wealth and having a larger tax base would improve it, because the theory being that if we needed to make our debt payment, we are struggling, a wealthier community could handle that increase better than a not as wealthy community. And then a larger tax base, you'd have more people to spread over that large increase if you needed to. But the one that we do have control over that could lead to an upgrade is moderation of debt and fixed costs. The factors that could lead to a downgrade would be material declines in available fund balance or liquidity, which is that one piece that we have a lot of control over, a contraction or reduction of the city's tax base, or a weakened demographic profile, and then material growth in the city's debt burden is there too. And now I know you all know we've got a lot of big projects coming down that are legacy projects. We are continuing to grow, we need new roads. So we're keeping an eye out on this. The thing that's helping us though is that TID 4 is doing exceptionally well and had all that debt that we are paying off. So my hope is that those two kind of counteract each other.
We do have a question. Gabriella?
So does the size of our city, though, factor into it? Because, I mean, we're a relatively small city. It seems like a AA1 is like a really good rating for a city of our size.
It is, though I'll say there's at least one community our size or smaller that is a AAA in
Okay.
Wisconsin.
So it's possible, but it's rare.
Yes, but we are very strong. I mean, past councils have made some very hard but smart financial decisions to make sure we are in this strong of a position.
And if I recall correctly from Finance Committee, when you're doing the general obligation debt sales, we saved a lot of money because of this rating. Is that, like, I remember looking at the numbers and being like, whoa, it's amazing. So I don't remember it off the top of my head. I should go back and look at my notes, but.
Yes, absolutely. So that goes back to that stability comment. So our debt is cheap because it's tax exempt from the federal level, but also because it's very secure. So we're secure because we're a government, but on top of that, we are a government that knows, that has good financial policies in place and isn't a risk. So that's why we're able to get such great rates. And I will say Fitchburg hasn't always been that way. So, I mean, we have been a AA1 very proudly for a while now. But back in 1993, there was a completely different situation. They had negative equity. They were struggling to make things balance. They were almost junk bond status. Like, it was a very bad situation. And they brought Ellers in, the financial advisors that we continue to use. That's when all these policies were established. That's when they made some significant budgetary changes, and they really turned that ship around. And now it's your guys' responsibility to make sure that you keep that ship afloat. So policy number 1, fund balance within the general fund. So our policy is to have, it's now called unassigned fund balance. This is new terminology. A minimum between 15% and 25% of the revenues, plus the amount of shared revenue set aside for the previous year. Now, this policy is important because it helps us with unexpected events. You may recall with COVID, we actually said we will spend up to $250,000 of our fund balance if we need to, because we didn't know what was happening and what was going to need to happen. So we had that because of this policy. And if something else crazy happens, we have some flexibility there. It also helps with our cash flow, to make sure that we have the money that we need to meet our expenses. And so while our policy is 15 to 25%, Moody's actually recommends 30% or looks for 30% to get that AAA rating that we're looking for. So while that's our policy, I really see that 30% as our target. As of the end of 2020, we did meet it. We are at 36.4%. This is the chart that the auditor shared with the Finance Committee last night that shows that amount. So the orange bar is that 15%. Black bar is the 25% for our policy. The blue line is the Moody's amount, and then the green is where we actually were. So we were above even what Moody's is looking for, which is really something to be proud of. In the past, when we've had an amount that was over that target, we've used it to buy land for the new fire station. Concept being, how many times is the city going to buy land? Not that often, right? Very clearly a one-time thing for a one-time influx. But it's also, land doesn't appreciate. If we buy that, it's not like it's going to cause an ongoing obligation, just the land itself, and will always be worth at least that amount that we bought for it. So that's something that we'll have to continue talking about as we go forward.
I do have a question on that, though. On a different note, we may own the land, but we lose the tax base, though, do we not?
That's a fair point. But we could sell it and get the tax base back.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's all about planning.
Yep. And it wasn't a lot. If I remember correctly, it was $1 million, which, I mean, is a lot of money, but it wasn't like our full fund balance. It was just the amount that was above the amount. And really, the council had committed to that project anyways, so they knew that they were going to buy that land. So rather than borrowing for it, we used that justification to not have to borrow as much and save on the interest.
Sure. Okay.
Also in that policy is that shared revenue that we want to account for, and we do have that set aside in a separate bucket, along with 2 years' worth of that expenditure restraint funding, because it is an optional program, but it is getting tight on us, and I expected that with the TID closure and with the town of Madison, we may not be eligible for expenditure restraint, because at the end of the day, we need to meet the service requirements. So we have that set aside too. So that's there kind of as that fail-safe for us. But I think that's good too from a shared revenue perspective. The state continues to talk about whether or not that shared revenue amount should be decreased. I know there's a lot of conversation now with COVID, because the state budget is struggling just as much as ours is, should that be one of the things that gets reduced. So it's really comforting to me as the financial planner, part of this process, to know that we have that cushion there. So if the state does reverse course, we have at least a year to figure out how we're going to handle it and not have to make drastic decisions on short notice. But there are other aids that we get from the state that have also been talked about getting eliminated that we don't set aside yet. This is, though, where we have to balance. We should be financially prudent, and that's something we should be very proud of ourselves for. We also don't want to be so conservative that we're, losing opportunities, significant opportunities. So you look at like that general transportation aid at the bottom of 1.6 million. It'd be fantastic if we had all of these set aside too for 1 year, but I just don't know that that's reasonable. Though that would be another option for the amount that we're over the target right now, could go towards setting aside for this rainy day fund, for lack of a better phrase. The second policy is tax rate stability. So this says that the tax rate that we have for debt will not exceed $2.25, and that is an equalized value calculation. And this is important. It's kind of like your mortgage payment, so it's how much are we willing to pay each year, inflated based on how big our city is and how much our tax base is. That's why it's a rate instead of just a dollar amount, but how much of that mortgage payment are we willing to pay? So the actual for 19, 20, and 21 are listed up there. And it does look like there's a lot of room, which is fantastic. I think that's a great thing for us. But remember, there's a lot of legacy projects coming up between the Lacey Road project, the Fish Hatchery Road, rest of that project. The public safety facility is in the CIP. So there's a lot of big projects coming up. And also that 2.25 is not a goal. It is a maximum amount. So the fact that we're lower is good. And that means, that's less money that we have to collect from everybody to pay for interest on that debt. So Ellers will share with us what this amount is when they go through that financial management plan with us next time. The third policy is matching revenues and expenses for debt. So this we actually used as a practice. So in 2020 when we borrowed for those uptown roads that needed to get put in that are specially assessed or planned to be specially assessed. So we matched the payments on that debt with when we think we're going to get those special assessment payments back in. So we wanted to try to make those as even as possible. Really from a cash flow perspective, because if you have to make payments before you get that special assessment revenue in, you might be in a cash flow problem. Or if you're collecting the special assessments faster than you're paying off the debt, now you're paying more in interest than you really needed to. So as of the end of the year, we met that policy. Number 4 is financing for capital equipment and road maintenance. So basically, we're saying that we should fund ongoing equipment and roadway maintenance costs from property taxes and expenditure restraint money. We shouldn't be borrowing for ongoing maintenance items. That's important because borrowed money costs us more in the long run. So it costs for debt issuance costs, but then also the interest that we have to pay on it. So for 2020, we have that $500,000 threshold. That's how it's kind of that first hurdle to determine if it's a legacy project that we think borrowing is important rather than, say, a maintenance item that should be paid for by property taxes or other funding. And then we're still continuing to phase ourselves off of the road maintenance borrowing. So we should not be borrowing for road maintenance. If you pay $1 million a year, you should just cash finance that. If you borrow $1 million every year to get that same level, you're now paying interest on something with no real timing benefit. So we are at least at the tail end of this plan. So we just have a couple more years left. If it was up to me, we would pull this Band-Aid off and just stop now. But I don't know that we necessarily want to do that, and at least we're showing that we are committed to that policy. We have very much so followed through on it, and so when we tell people we have a plan, we're sticking with it. So we are almost done with that. Number 5 is preservation of our borrowing capacity. So the state limits how much debt we are allowed to have. It's based on 5% of equalized value. That's the green line that's on the chart. The city actually has a policy that limits us more than that. So our policy is 3% of equalized value. That's the purple line. The reason why that's important is we want to have flexibility within that statute, so that if a large unexpected item comes up that we have no other options, we need to borrow for, we'd want to make sure we can, that we're not tied up. Plus, they're always talking, in fact, right now, I'm somewhat hopeful that they will stop taxing personal property. I think that would be very helpful from a variety of reasons. But if they do that, that will be a big drop in our equalized value because of a policy issue. And we don't want to violate state statute now about how much debt we have because of a policy change or a taxing change that was done. So we are committed to that 3% instead. And then there's also things just beyond our control. So the housing bubble, when that popped before, our value dropped a lot. So if you're right at that state statute number, the market tanks, now you're violating state statute and are in a lot of trouble. So having that cushion there for us helps us in the long run. And then as of the end of the year, we were at 1.71%, which is 57% of our policy. So good spot there too. But again, we have a lot of big projects coming up that we plan to borrow for, so we do need to keep an eye on it. Percent of debt expense as a ratio of operating budget. So this one is, policy is between 15 and 25%. The reason why that's important is if you're spending too much of your budget on debt, then you would be too leveraged. So as of the end of 2021, we actually violated this policy with an asterisk. So at the end of 2021, we were at with the 2021 budget, we were at 39.5% of our total expenses was spent on debt. But there's two important things that I think we need to adjust there. One is that big TID debt prepayment that we budgeted for. Remember, TID 4 is doing fantastic. They're going to pay off that interchange debt once they're able to. It's able to be called in 2021. So we budgeted for that so that we can do it. And I really think we need to take that out because that was not the spirit of this calculation by any means. So I'm adjusting for that. And then we also had what's called a crossover refunding. So we borrowed money. It closed on December 30th of 2020, cutting it real close. And we borrowed the new money to refund the library, but I didn't pay off the old debt for the library until the second week of January. So as of the end of the year, we had both the old debt and the new debt on our books. So if I adjust for that crossover funding as well, we were at 20.3%. So within policy, pretty stable over the years, but ticking up a little bit. Number 7 is the debt payment structure and duration, and I'll tell you there's 10 total, so we're almost done. What this says is we really want to be borrowing at a term that makes sense. So for the most part, we borrow for 10 years. If it's a large infrastructure project or a building, we'll borrow for 20 years, which is allowed under bonds. But we want to match the life of the asset with the term of how long we're paying it. And we also don't want to structure our debt over that 10 years and have it be a small amount for years 1 through 9 and then a huge balloon payment in year 10, because that would be shady, if nothing else, too. So we say that we won't do that. This is important because only bonds can be done for the full 20 years. Notes can actually only be done for 10 years. And then that balloon payment that I talked about is really the definition of kicking the can down the road, and that's just not financially responsible.
Misty, you're familiar with present value and future value. Mm-hmm. I'm sure more well-versed than I am in engineering economics. When we're borrowing money, we borrow, say, Fish Hatchery Road, say $20 million to do the project. Where do we ever figure out what it's actually costing us, by the time we repay? I don't ever see that number shown to anyone. I never hear it talked about. Where is it? Do we ever calculate it?
So that would be through the debt issuance process. So for those big projects like that, there's a chart in our transcript that shows each one of those big projects and then how much in principal and interest over the life of the debt, as well as how much issuance costs we pay for it. So that would be in there, and I can send you that link or a page out of that if you're interested. The only nuance is it's by debt issuance, though, so it won't be Fish Hatchery Road as a whole. It'll be the Fish Hatchery Road that was borrowed in 2020, and then a separate one for the other years. So the current actual, as of now, is we'll pay 70% of our debt off in 10 years. So we are sticking to that policy as well, not overextending ourselves. Number 8 is borrowing for TID districts. So this one I know has also had a decent amount of discussion lately. So in general, we say that we will not borrow for city-funded TID projects unless we know we have a development agreement or some other thing to back it up. We don't want to put ourselves out there, take all that risk on without having, something to support it. The reason why it's been talked about lately is Fish Hatchery Road, TID 10, and then Lacey Road, we're talking about it recently too. And I'll say the reason why it's important is because TID debt that's not able to be paid off by the TID at the end of the life is the full responsibility of the city. The TID windfall, if there is one, gets allocated across all of the jurisdictions. If there's a shortfall, it's our responsibility. And the thought process there is while the Joint Review Board participates in the process, we are really the ones that are managing it and are responsible for those risks and what we're willing to take.
I'm sorry, you gotta excuse my ignorance. What's the windfall? The taxpayers borrow the money to pay for the infrastructure, whatever the project. They pay it back with interest till it's done, and then they start paying into the general fund with taxes. What's the windfall, Misty? I'm missing that.
Yeah, so there's kind of two perspectives. One is that but-for test. So if this development wouldn't happen otherwise, unless we give them that incentive, then it builds our tax base at the close. What you were just kind of talking about, they start paying to the general fund. That's the one piece of it. The more direct piece is at the end of TID 4, when TID 4 closes and the railroad is done. I suspect there will be a cash balance left in the TID. And that money then is allocated to all of the jurisdictions, the overlying jurisdictions. Each gets their piece based on our share of the property tax bill. So before you ask, I don't know what that number is yet. We're working on that. The reports go to the Joint Review Board in June, so we should know that soon. But that's where that just real tangible windfall would come from. Thank you. So in general, we met this. So we did borrow for the interchange with TID 4, but we had the special assessment clause in the development agreement. If you remember, you had to waive that for Quick Trip, right? That was that backfill that we had put in place before we agreed to borrow for the interchange. That was successful. TID 6, which is the one over by Target, we did borrow for Spoke and Sprocket, but we had other development agreements in hand that we knew were going to be able to pay that off. TID 10, Fish Hatchery Road, as we were borrowing, we looked each time to make sure that we had enough projected increment to pay that off, and we have so far. There's a lot of other project plan costs that we want to do, but those will have to wait until we know that we have more increment to pay for. First priority needs to be to pay off that Fish Hatchery Road debt. And then in TID 9 is the one that we know is coming, where there is still some uncertainty, but we at least know we've got 2 buildings that are done, an expansion that is done, and 2 other very large buildings that are in the works. So it's still a risk. I'm not going to say I am not nervous about it, but it's reasonable. And we'll know more once we get those reports done for the Joint Review Board. This isn't really a policy, but I thought we would toot our own horn for a little bit, and the auditors pointed this out a couple of times last night too, is that all 3 of our utilities at this point are debt-free. And I think that's huge. Water utilities in particular in Wisconsin are notoriously underfunded, and our water utility is healthy and doing well. A big part of that is because of the impact fees that we have that helps pay for all of that new infrastructure. So it's our water utility is very healthy and something to be proud of. Sewer utility is also healthy, very little risk there because of MMSD. The problem we're going to have is stormwater. So I know you all know this already, but I'll say it again. So we approved that pretty significant rate increase to try to make sure stormwater could stay healthy. And we may have to borrow for some projects to get caught up. We will look at that as the projects come through, see if there's other options. We did submit for an earmark. Maybe we'll be able to get that or some other grant funding. But that at least is something to be very proud of for today, with the caveat that it may not be in the future. Number 9, land use and growth. So this is essentially saying that we encourage new growth as long as it is in compliance with our master land use plan and conforms to all of our requirements. And the reason why that's important is new growth is a larger tax base and just more property owners to spread the costs across. And as of the end of the year, we met that. And then last one for this section of the policies is the maintenance and enhancement of credit rating. Basically, what this says is we are always trying to be AAA. That is our goal. And yes, we might be small, and maybe it's not necessarily realistic, but it doesn't mean that it's not something we should try to do. I'm never going to run the Boston Marathon. Doesn't mean that I shouldn't get my butt outside and try to run once in a while. So that's important because the higher your credit rating, the lower your debt issuance costs are going to be, and then it also tells the world, including our taxpayers, that we have financial health. And I think our taxpayers think that that's important. And as of the end of the year, we were AA1 still. So this section, the comparative data sources, I will breeze through, mostly just there for your information. I went through a lot of stuff about where Fitchburg is, what our financial policies are, what our metrics are, but it's so interesting to know how we compare to other municipalities, especially in Wisconsin. And there's a couple of great tools available. The first one is this Wisconsin Policy Forum, and there's the link for you. And they've got a bunch of different categories by which you can look at different data for municipalities across the state. So for example, I did this one, and you could use this custom tool to pick just which municipalities in particular you want to compare yourself to. So I did that with just our other fellow Dane County area places. So this chart is the debt per capita, and then as compared to the state limit. So I thought this was an interesting one. There's the city of Fitchburg at the beginning, and then this is our street maintenance spending per capita. You can see we're at the tail end of actually Dane County municipalities. So I realize data is very manipulative sometimes, like you can make it say a lot of different things. But this is coming from a third party again that says these are the metrics that you should look at. And so you can go and see what those are. Another great resource is the Wisconsin Department of Revenue. So if you go to this local government dashboard link on there, I looked up Fitchburg, and there's this quick glance tab. It just shows you what your changes have been in the different high-level categories. And then the green arrow is positive, and the red arrow is unfavorable. So you can kind of see really easily at a glance how our operations have been doing from the financial perspective over time. And then there's this revenue and expenditure tab, which I like too. So you can pick your local government in that top corner, and then you can pick if you want revenues or expenses or certain ones, and then it creates that chart at the bottom too. So it's just another way to visualize different financial information, again, from a third party based on the forms that I'm required to report to them at the end of every year. So it's all vetted data. It's a great place to look. CIP process and next steps. So this was kind of our kickoff to the CIP process. Again, the document will get released June 4th. So we always start with what last year's adopted CIP was. The department heads put in their recommendations for changes or new projects or pulled projects, whatever their suggestions are. And then we go through the process, and then Mayor Richardson puts together his proposed CIP. And then any changes from the last version you guys adopted until Aaron's proposed new version, we have to specifically identify each one of those. And there's a separate summary page at the beginning of the document that does that, so that you don't have to go through each page and see what changed. You can go to that kind of one-shot report to see them all.
Why we are, you say adopt the CIP is July 27?
Mm-hmm.
Last year we adopted like in the middle of August.
We delayed it because of COVID.
Oh, okay.
So we're now back on our normal schedule.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So then once the mayor's proposed CIP comes out on June 6th, you guys will have that special finance committee meeting that Randy mentioned at council last night. It's the 14th, and I did send you all calendar appointments, so you should have that. I'd like to say, though, real quick, we had a bit of an overlap with another meeting, so I actually might, sorry, Randy, we might need to move it to 6:30. So I'll let you guys know if we need to do that or not. Just learned about that recently. So we will have those presentations. All the department heads will come in, share their projects. It'll be your chance to really get all the information you need to make a good decision. That's where you should ask your questions, ask why it's important, ask what it means if you don't do it. Ask all of those things there. Those department heads are knowledgeable and can answer all of those questions or get back to you. But we're here to help you make a good decision. At the next committee of the whole meeting, then, we have the financial management plan, where Ellers, our financial advisor, will take the mayor's CIP, put it into their projections, and then look at all those different policies and help us identify our opportunities and our our problems. And again, I like having them do it. Frankly, it is something I could do, but I think there's value in having that third party doing it to make sure that I don't have a blind spot, but also just know that there's another party that has best practices across the state that can share that information for us. Once we get through that kind of information gathering stage, that's when all of you council members can put in your proposed amendments. That can be to add a project, delete a project, change timing, change dollar amounts, change funding sources, whatever changes you think should be considered. You will fill out a form that I'll email you to let the council know and the public know what you think that change should be. And then I will put those all together in a packet, and we'll put that out to the public and to all of you at the same time. I'd like to say here real quick that use your staff. You know, your department heads have a lot of information. I'm obviously available to help you out too. So feel free to reach out to us if you want some help, you know, making sure that you understand the context of what it is that you're proposing to do. And we can help you, you know, write it up. When they get submitted to me, I will review them, and I'll see if I'm understanding what you're trying to do. Because if I don't understand, then my guess is the public's not going to understand either. So I'll ask some clarity type questions. You still have full responsibility and authority over the form. I'm just trying to be helpful to make it as good of a document as we can. And then they'll get all posted. So that document will go out. We'll have another CIP, or another public hearing, and then at the council meeting, as a body, you guys will go amendment by amendment, discuss them, amend the amendment perhaps, and vote on them. And then at the end of the night, you will have an adopted CIP. So.
And with amendments, the sooner you talk to Misty, the better. It's not fair to call her on the 5th or the 6th and say, hey, I gotta get this in quick. That's not fair. Do it way before that, please, for her.
The other big thing is that we don't take amendments from the floor. So if you want to make a change to the CIP, it has to have that form filled out. The reason is for transparency and to make sure it's vetted. You know, when you put those forms out, that's what we share with the public so that they know kind of what you guys are thinking about and possibly contemplating, as well as all the department heads being able to help understand if there's pieces that need to affect other pieces. So we don't accept any amendments from the floor at CIP nor at budget time. So if you want to make any changes, make sure you do that form. And then after you get the adopted CIP, that first version goes in the first, that first year goes in the first version of the budget that I provide to Aaron. And then if he does make changes from your adopted CIP to his proposed budget, we have to specifically identify those there again so that you don't have to go hunting and see what we changed. It's all for full transparency. You know, these were the items that were changed and why. Last slide, replacement fund concept. So I know I've had this one in here a lot, and we've talked about it a decent amount, but the purpose of this is really to help plan for the future. So it is a way to even out the property tax levy, you know, rather than having a $500,000 or $300,000 truck one year and then nothing the next year, you know, you can have those spikes. So you even that amount out. And so if you have a $100,000 vehicle that you think is going to last 10 years, you put $10,000 a year away. And then when you need to replace it, you have the cash there to do it without, you know, arguing about it or having to worry about where the funding is going to come from. It also is a great way to maintain intergenerational equity. So one of the arguments why people think borrowing is important is you spread out that tax burden over the life of the road. So Lacey Road, for example, if we paid it all in this year with cash, that'd be amazing. But let's say we did, we jacked up taxes to pay for that big project, it would only be those property owners that had to pay the project. So one of the arguments for borrowing is you borrow over 20 years instead. So it's 20 years worth of people moving in and out of the city that have to pay for that road. This replacement fund is very similar concept. So, but it's front-loading it instead of back-loading it. So as that piece of equipment is used up, those property taxes are paid into this fund to make the replacement, and then you keep cycling it over. So you get that intergenerational equity again. And so we're continuing to implement this across more departments. So we've got police and fire and fact TV and building inspection, and a lot of them already have that, and we keep looking for more opportunities to implement this strategy. Again, it's just a way to show our thoughtfulness and our intention on long-term financial planning rather than the shifting of costs that can happen. That is it. Any other questions?
Yeah, questions?
So again, I know it's a lot of information. I throw so much at you guys all, and I know it's a lot of repeat too for those of you that were here other years or were observing the process other years. But I just think it's a nice way to set that stage so we know what we're getting into and can be intentional about this process because it is exceptionally important.
Okay.
Thank you, Misty. Excellent
Yeah,
presentation.
if there are no further questions, thank you. Thank you very much, Misty. Announcements, next item on the agenda. The next committee of the whole meeting is June 23rd, 2021. Do I hear a motion for adjournment?
So moved.
Second.
Discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? We are adjourned at 9:17 p.m.